Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine your entire life as a single candle burning quietly in a dark room. You don't know how much wax is left. You only know this: the flame is already halfway down, and with each flicker it's melting into nothing. We like to pretend that life is an endless road, days stretching far beyond the horizon. We plan, we save, we postpone, as if time will politely wait for us to be ready. But it won't. Life is not a patient teacher. It's more like a river that doesn't stop flowing, whether you're swimming, standing still, or looking the other way. Some people discover this truth when a doctor whispers news they never wanted to hear. Others see it when a loved one is here in the morning and gone by nightfall. But the wisest don't wait for tragedy to learn. They wake up now, while their hands are still warm and their breath still moves easily in their chest. Buddhism has a word for this impermanence: Anicca. It is the quiet, undeniable truth that everything changes. Youth fades, beauty shifts, relationships evolve. Even the very cells in your body are not the same ones you had last year, and yet we cling to all of it as if holding tight could keep it from slipping away. Here's the paradox: this isn't meant to make you afraid, it's meant to set you free. When you see life as it truly is, brief, uncertain, ungraspable, you stop wasting it on what doesn't matter. You begin to notice the taste of your tea in the morning, the way sunlight bends through a window, the texture of a friend's laugh. You stop living for someday and begin living for now. I once met a man in his 70s who told me, "The thing that surprises me most about life is how quickly it passes. I thought I had forever. Turns out, forever was just a few decades wearing a disguise." He said it without sadness, only a quiet wonder, as though he had just read the final page of a book and closed it slowly, cherishing the ending. And maybe that's the gift of knowing our time is short. We start treating every conversation as if it could be the last. We forgive faster. We say the words we've been holding back. We let go of petty grudges that feel too heavy for such a fleeting journey. Life isn't measured by the number of years you get. It's measured by how awake you are within them. Some live 80 years without truly paying attention. Others live a single day so fully that it outshines a lifetime. If you truly knew how little time was left, how would you spend this very breath? Would you use it to complain, to impress, to worry, or would you use it to be fully here in this moment, in this body, alive? The candle is still burning, the river is still moving, and right now so are you. If you watch a river for long enough, you'll notice something strange. It's never the same river twice. The water that touched your toes a moment ago is already miles away, replaced by something entirely new. The banks change, the stones shift, even the air above it is in constant motion. And yet, we still call it the same river. Life works the same way. Every breath you take, every heartbeat, every glance at the world, it's all part of a ceaseless unfolding. Cells die and are born. Thoughts appear and vanish. Seasons turn without asking your permission. Nothing, not one thing, stays exactly as it was. Buddhism calls this truth Anicca, impermanence, not as a theory but as the very fabric of existence. From the tiniest grain of sand to the most distant galaxy, everything is in motion. Everything is in the process of becoming and unbecoming. We often live as if we're standing on solid ground, but if you could zoom in on reality, you'd see it's more like walking across a floor of shifting sand. The ground isn't fixed, neither are you. And this is where our suffering begins. We keep trying to build permanent castles in a world made of waves. Think of the moments you felt pain when something changed, when a friend drifted away, when a job ended, when your body didn't look the way it used to. The pain wasn't just from the change itself. It was from the silent belief that it shouldn't change at all. We keep thinking if I can just hold on, it will stay the same. But impermanence doesn't bargain. It doesn't take bribes. It moves forward like a tide, pulling everything along. And here's the part most of us miss. Impermanence isn't only about loss. It's also about possibility. The very fact that things change means that pain doesn't last forever, that heartbreak softens, that mistakes can be outgrown, that today's version of you is not your final draft. A single seed transforms into a towering tree. A dark night gives way to dawn. A closed door clears space for another to open. Impermanence is not the enemy, it's the silent architect of renewal. If you begin to see this truth clearly, something shifts inside. You stop clinging so tightly. You stop fearing the natural turning of life's wheel. You begin to trust that change, while unpredictable, is not here to destroy you. It's here to teach you. And like the river, you learn to flow. Once you accept impermanence, you can finally meet life as it is, not as you wish it to be. When we hear the truth of impermanence, part of us nods in agreement. Yes, we say, I understand everything changes. But there's another part, a quieter, more stubborn part that whispers, not this, not me, not the things I love. It's the part that grips a relationship even when it's fading. That clings to youth as though it can be bottled and stored away. That keeps souvenirs of the past, not just on shelves, but in the corners of the heart. This is what the Buddha called tanha, craving, the deep hunger to make the impermanent permanent. It's not just wanting something. It's needing it to stay exactly as it is, even as the world keeps moving. Clinging feels safe for a while, like a child holding a favorite toy, afraid someone might take it away. But imagine trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. And the tighter you cling to people, to moments, to ideas about yourself, the faster they seem to fade. Sometimes we cling not to joy but to pain, replaying old arguments, wearing past mistakes like a badge. Why? Because even pain can feel familiar and the unknown feels terrifying. We'd rather hold a burning coal than open our hands to emptiness. But here's the irony. The moment we stop gripping so tightly, we don't lose everything. We simply stop being dragged by it. Imagine standing in a river, holding onto a branch as the current tugs at you. Your arms ache, your body strains. The water pulls harder, and then you let go. At first you're afraid, but soon you realize you can float. You're still in the river, but you're moving with it, not fighting it. Letting go doesn't mean we stop loving. It means we stop trying to freeze love in place. It doesn't mean we stop caring about our work, our dreams, or our health. It means we stop believing they must unfold exactly as we demand in order for us to be at peace. Think about the things you're holding onto right now. A memory you replay, a future you're chasing, a version of yourself you refuse to outgrow. What would happen if, just for a moment, you loosened your grip? In that opening, there's room to breathe, room to live without the constant fear of loss. Because when you're no longer clinging, you're free to experience life as it is, ever-changing, unpredictable but infinitely rich. We cling so fiercely because we believe we're protecting someone, this solid, enduring me at the center of it all. We feed it, defend it, decorate it. We tell stories about it. I am this kind of person, I'm not that kind of person, I was wronged, I deserve better, I am important. It feels like the most real thing in the world. But what if it isn't? Buddhism offers a quiet, almost unsettling truth. This self we guard so carefully is more like a mirage than a mountain. Look closely and it begins to dissolve. The Buddha described what we call self as a collection of 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Together they create the experience of being you. But none of them on their own are truly you, and none of them stay the same for even a moment. Your body, constantly changing, aging, renewing. Your feelings rising and falling like waves. Your perceptions colored by mood, memory, and belief. Your thoughts appearing, vanishing, replaced by others. Even your awareness shifting from one object to the next. Like beads on a string, these elements give the impression of a single identity. But when you search for the string itself, the fixed self holding it all together, you find nothing solid. At first, this can feel frightening. If there's no permanent me, who's living this life, who's making choices, who's listening right now? But sit with the question and fear begins to soften into something else: freedom. If there's no rigid self, you're not bound by the past. You're not trapped in a fixed identity. You can grow, change, and respond to life without dragging yesterday's story into today. You're not the sum of your mistakes. You're not limited by the roles others have assigned you. You're a living, breathing process, fluid as a river, spacious as the sky. Think of a rainbow. It's real enough to see, but try to touch it and your hand passes through empty air. Does that make it any less beautiful? Or does it make you appreciate it more, knowing it's a momentary gift? When we loosen our grip on the idea of a fixed self, something remarkable happens. Compassion grows. Because if I'm not as solid as I think, neither are you. We're both just passing patterns in the great unfolding of life. And if that's true, maybe we don't need to spend our days defending a fortress that was never really there. Once you see that the self is less like a fortress and more like a cloud, the question naturally arises. If there's nothing permanent to protect, what's left to hold on to? This is where the path begins to feel lighter. Letting go doesn't mean giving up on life. It means releasing the illusion that you can control it. It means loosening your grip on the way things should be and meeting them as they are. It's not resignation, it's participation without chains. Think of your hands. They can't hold on to everything. When they're clenched, nothing new can enter. But when they open even just a little, life has a way of placing unexpected treasures in your palm. We've been trained to believe that freedom comes from acquiring more success, more love, more certainty. But the truth is, the deepest freedom often comes from subtracting, from setting down the mental weights we've been carrying for years, the resentment that poisons our joy, the expectations that crush our relationships, the fears that keep us playing small. At first, letting go feels like loss. The old stories, the familiar roles, the people who no longer fit, when they drift away, it can leave a hollow ache. But emptiness isn't always absence. Sometimes it's space. And space is where possibility lies. The Buddha compared clinging to holding a burning coal in your hand. You think you're holding it to throw at someone else, but all the while, you're the one getting burned. Letting go is simply opening your hand. And here's the secret no one tells you. When you stop gripping so hard, you don't float away into nothingness. You land more deeply in the present. You taste your food without rushing. You hear music without thinking of your to-do list. You feel love without trying to lock it in a box. Life becomes less about keeping and more about being. And in that shift, the world opens up. Letting go isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. One in which your heart is light enough to move with the changing winds, and your mind is clear enough to see the horizon without fear. When the hands are open, when the grip has loosened, a new question arises. Where do I go from here? Freedom is not just the absence of chains, it's the presence of direction. Without it, we can drift, chasing one passing desire after another, mistaking movement for meaning. The Buddha offered something remarkable, a map. Not a rigid set of rules, but a path you can walk, step by step, to live with clarity and compassion. He called it the Noble Eightfold Path. 8 strands woven into a single, balanced way of being. It begins with right view, seeing the world as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. Understanding impermanence. Recognizing the roots of suffering. Knowing that your actions ripple out into the lives of others. From that clarity comes right intention. Choosing to walk with kindness, with the desire to cause no harm, and with a mind turned toward growth rather than greed or ill will. Then there is right speech, speaking in ways that heal instead of wound. Choosing words as if they were seeds, knowing they will take root in the hearts of others. Right action follows, not just avoiding harm, but actively cultivating goodness. It's in the hands that help, the honesty that holds, the choices that lift rather than crush. Right livelihood, earning your way in the world without causing suffering to others. Work that doesn't betray your values. Work that you can look at without shame. Then comes right effort, not the frantic push of perfectionism, but the steady cultivation of what is wholesome. Watering the seeds of patience, generosity, and wisdom, while gently removing the weeds of resentment and fear. Right mindfulness, keeping your attention rooted in the present moment. Not lost in yesterday's shadows or tomorrow's mirages, but awake to the simple truth of now. And finally, right concentration, training the mind to rest deeply, to see clearly, to go beyond the surface and touch the stillness beneath all movement. This path is not a ladder to climb, It's more like a circle, a wheel that turns, each spoke strengthening the others. You can begin anywhere. Speech can lead to mindfulness. Mindfulness can deepen intention. Intention can refine action. The important thing is to keep walking. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of the Noble Eightfold Path is this: you don't walk it alone. Every step toward wisdom and compassion connects you more deeply with the world, even as it frees you from being bound by it. A path is only a path when it is walked, and each step you take is already the destination. We all walk for different reasons, some for success, some for love, some because we don't know what else to do. But beneath every step, whether we admit it or not, there is one longing we share. We want to be free from suffering, not just the obvious suffering, pain, loss, loneliness, but the quieter kinds too. The restlessness that keeps us chasing one more achievement, one more purchase, one more promise. The constant comparing, the subtle fear that we're not enough, the ache of wanting life to be different than it is. We imagine freedom from suffering as a prize waiting at the end of some long race. Once I get there, I'll be happy. But the Buddha's teaching is more radical. Freedom isn't somewhere else. It's here, hidden in plain sight, uncovered in the moment we stop fighting reality. This doesn't mean life will be without pain. Bodies age, relationships change, loved ones die, but pain and suffering are not the same thing. Pain is the wound. Suffering is the story we wrap around it. This shouldn't have happened. I can't live without this. This always happens to me. The wound may be real, but the chains are optional. Freedom comes when we begin to see that everything, every joy, every sorrow is just part of the great tide of life. We can let it wash through us without needing to dam the river. And when we stop building dams, the water flows clean, clear, and unblocked. What truly matters is not how much we've gathered, but how lightly we can carry what we have. Not how perfectly we've lived, but how deeply we've loved, without fear of loss, without the need to possess. Not how many years we've been alive, but how many moments we've been truly awake. The Eightfold Path is the compass. Compassion is the way we walk it. Wisdom is the light that shows us where our own mind is creating unnecessary suffering. And letting go, again and again, is the key that keeps unlocking the cage. The freedom we're seeking has never been far away. It's been here all along, quietly waiting for us to notice that the door was never locked. We spend much of our lives turning away from death. We don't speak of it in polite conversation. We disguise it with softer words, passing away, gone to a better place. We treat it like an intruder, something unnatural that steals from us. But death is not an intruder. It is life's shadow, ever present, inseparable from the light. The Buddha urged his students to remember death often, not to depress them, but to awaken them. When you truly face the fact that nothing lasts, not the breath you're taking now, not the people you love, not even this planet as it is, you begin to see the preciousness shimmering through every moment. We fear death because we imagine it as the end of me. But if the self is an illusion, fluid, changing without fixed edges, then what is it that truly ends? The body will dissolve, the thoughts will fade, the heartbeat will stop. But the river that carried you here has always been flowing, long before you were born, long after your name is forgotten. Death teaches in ways comfort never can. It strips away the illusion that we have endless time. It makes procrastination feel absurd. It clarifies what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go. Petty grudges look small in the face of the inevitable. Love, kindness, presence. These suddenly feel urgent because they are. In some traditions, monks meditate in charnel grounds, sitting beside the remains of the dead, not out of morbid fascination, but as a reminder, this too will be me. When you understand this, not just in the mind, but in the marrow, fear begins to loosen its hold. Death stops being a dark wall at the end of life and becomes a mirror, reflecting how you're living right now. And here is the gift. When you befriend death, life no longer passes unnoticed. The taste of tea, the weight of a hand in yours, the way morning light falls on the floor. You stop saving your joy for later. Later is never guaranteed. Death doesn't ask us to be afraid. It asks us to be awake. To live so fully that when the moment comes to let go, there is nothing left unsaid, unloved, or unlived. It's one thing to understand impermanence while sitting on a quiet mountaintop. It's another to remember it when you're stuck in traffic, running late, your phone buzzing with unanswered messages. This is the world we live in now, a world that moves fast, demands much, and rarely leaves space for silence. So how do we carry these ancient truths into a modern life? How do we walk the noble Eightfold path through grocery store aisles and Zoom meetings, school drop-offs and late-night emails? It begins the same way it always has, with attention. You don't need to be in a monastery to practice mindfulness. You can bring it into the way you sip your morning coffee, the way you listen to a colleague without thinking of your reply, the way you notice your breath instead of scrolling through another feed. In a culture built on distraction, attention is an act of rebellion. Compassion, too, takes on a new shape here. It might look like patience with a stressed-out coworker, or kindness to yourself when you don't meet your own impossible standards, or choosing to unplug for a day so you can actually see the people you love, instead of glancing at them over the glow of a screen. Modern life tempts us with constant comparison, everyone's highlight reel on display, every achievement measured against someone else's. Buddhist wisdom reminds us, the only life worth measuring is the one you are living, and the only person you need to surpass is the one you were yesterday. Even technology, so often blamed for our disconnection, can be a tool for awakening if we use it with intention. A mindful pause before posting, a moment of gratitude before hitting send. Using the reach of the digital world not to shout louder, but to listen more deeply. Applying Buddhist wisdom here isn't about rejecting the modern world. It's about not being swallowed by it. It's about walking through noise without losing your silence. About making space for stillness in a life that will never offer it unless you claim it for yourself. The truth is, the modern world doesn't make awakening harder. It just makes it easier to forget. And that's where your practice lies, not in escaping life, but in remembering again and again to live it. We began this journey with a simple truth. Life is short. We've walked through impermanence, through the trap of clinging, through the illusion of self. We've learned to let go, to walk a path of integrity, to see death not as an enemy but as a teacher. And here at the end, the circle closes where it began, right here in this moment. Living fully doesn't mean chasing every experience, filling every hour, or clinging to every joy as if it will slip away, because it will. It means meeting each moment without resistance or grasping. It means tasting the tea without thinking of your to-do list. It means hearing the laughter of someone you love and letting it echo inside you without fear of when it will end. It means showing up, fully awake, for the only life you'll ever have, the one happening right now. The past is a memory. The future is a dream. Only here, only now can you truly live. So breathe. Feel the ground beneath you. Let the noise fall away. Your life is not waiting for you somewhere else. It's here in the warmth of this breath, in the quiet between these words. And if these words have touched something in you, if you felt even a small shift towards stillness, clarity, or compassion, consider making space for more of it in your life. You can subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and walk with us through more reflections like these. Not to add another distraction to your day, but to plant a seed, a reminder to return again and again to the calm center of your own life. Because the journey isn't over. It never is. Every ending is just another step here now.